They laughed when I wasn't at the table, whispered when I asked questions, and pretended I didn't exist. Now, I'm going to make them remember my name. That sentence had been echoing in my mind for years, long before the first crack appeared in my family's perfect facade. My name is Sophie Kane, and for as long as I could remember, my own family had treated me like a shadow, always present, but never seen. The villains of this story are my own blood, my older sister, Victoria, and my parents, Margaret and Richard Kane. To the outside world, they were the ideal family, wealthy, influential, poised, but behind closed doors, I was invisible. At holidays, I sat at the edges of conversations, my accomplishments downplayed, my opinions dismissed. Victoria, the golden child, had everything, the accolades, the attention, the approval I craved. My parents would laugh at her jokes while mine were ignored, shrug at my successes while applauding her mediocrity. Over time, it became clear, they didn't just underestimate me, they had no intention of acknowledging me at all. Our dynamic was a subtle battlefield. Family dinners were carefully orchestrated arenas where my thoughts were trivialized. Birthdays, vacations, and even casual gatherings were opportunities for them to shine while I was forced into the background. Victoria thrived on attention, often monopolizing conversations, inserting herself into stories I had told, twisting memories to make herself the hero. My parents, blinded by favoritism or perhaps complicit in it, encouraged her, leaving me with a gnawing sense of insignificance. Outside of family gatherings, the world seemed kinder, but it could not erase the years of quiet dismissal. Friends noticed my subdued demeanor, my hesitations to celebrate accomplishments, and sometimes offered sympathy that felt inadequate. Yet every subtle snub, every ignored success, every whispered "oh, that's just Sophie being Sophie" became a weight, a reminder that in my own home, my existence was negotiable. The breaking point came one evening when I overheard my parents planning a lavish anniversary celebration. Victoria would host the toast, the speeches, the center stage. And me? I was told to handle the minor details, as if I were part of the furniture rather than a daughter. That night, as I stared at the invitations I had printed and labeled, I felt something stir, a quiet, dangerous awareness that my invisibility was ending. From that moment, I understood one undeniable truth: they had ignored me for too long, underestimated me for too long, and assumed I would remain passive. But the Sophie they thought they knew, the quiet, compliant, overlooked daughter, was only the beginning. Beneath that calm exterior, a storm was gathering. And in the silence of my room, I made a promise: they may have ignored me, but soon, they will never forget my name. At first, the signs were subtle, small enough to dismiss as coincidence, oversight, or simple miscommunication. But as the days passed, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Victoria would forget to include me in family outings, casually assuming I would be busy or disinterested. My parents would hand me chores or errands while praising her for her initiative in the very same situations. Every success I quietly celebrated, completing a demanding project at work, landing a scholarship, or helping a friend in need, was minimized or ignored. Meanwhile, Victoria's smallest achievements were broadcast, dissected, and applauded like trophies. There were lies too, quiet but corrosive. Stories I had shared in confidence were twisted and retold by Victoria, subtly altering the truth to make me appear less capable. My parents, perhaps naively, accepted these versions without question, reinforcing the narrative that I was unreliable or insignificant. Invitations I thought were mine by right, family dinners, vacations, even minor events, were quietly reassigned or forgotten, as if erasing me from the equation had become a habit. These small betrayals took a toll. Nights grew heavy with anxiety and frustration, and I began second-guessing myself. Was I imagining the patterns? Was I too sensitive? But then came moments too sharp to dismiss. The way my parents would laugh at jokes Victoria told that I had made first, the way my suggestions were met with polite nods only to be implemented by someone else and praised as brilliance. I began to feel like a ghost in my own family, present yet unseen, competent yet disregarded, yearning for recognition that never came. One particularly unnerving evening, I overheard a phone call while tidying the living room. Victoria was speaking to a friend, describing my recent achievements in a way that painted them as flukes, emphasizing my inexperience and lack of perspective. My heart sank. For years, I had tolerated the laughter, the whispers, the subtle erasure, but this was active sabotage. My own sister was shaping the narrative of my life behind my back, and my parents' silence implied approval. The emotional weight pressed on me like a physical force. I walked past family photos on the wall, all smiles and celebrations, but never mine. My accomplishments had become invisible markers in a gallery curated by others. I felt both fury and despair, a gnawing unease that whispered constantly, they thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I would remain powerless. And yet, beneath the hurt, a spark began to form. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet clarity emerged. I realized that my invisibility wasn't inevitable. My story didn't have to end in erasure or quiet suffering. There was a path forward, but it demanded patience, strategy, and courage. That night, I closed my eyes and felt the first real pulse of determination. They may have ignored me until now, but soon, they will understand that I see everything, and nothing can stay hidden forever. It hit me like a punch I had been bracing for but never truly expected. What I had suspected for months, years even, was worse than I could have imagined. Victoria and my parents weren't merely dismissive or inattentive, they had actively worked to erase me from our family's affairs and decision-making. The evidence was undeniable. I stumbled across a set of documents tucked away in the home office's financial statements, vacation plans, even invitations to family trusts and gatherings, all meticulously arranged to exclude me. Every major family investment, every event where my voice should have mattered, had been diverted, reassigned, or hidden. Shock paralyzed me first. I stared at the ledger showing a family vacation fund, noting how my contributions had been siphoned into accounts controlled by Victoria. I read emails where my parents discussed keeping Sophie occupied with work so she wouldn't notice decisions about inheritances, investments, or properties. The sister I had once trusted had intentionally manipulated the family narrative, twisting events and choices to make me appear naive, unreliable, or too emotional to participate in matters that affected all of us. Anger followed quickly, sharp and burning. The laughter, the whispered dismissals, the constant underestimation, they weren't harmless or accidental. Every slight, every casual erasure, had been a brick in the wall they built to keep me out. It wasn't just emotional cruelty, it was strategic, intentional, and calculated. My heart pounded, alternating between disbelief and rage. How could the people I loved the most plan something so meticulous, so cold? The heartbreak was deeper than the shock. I realized that the family dinners I had endured, the awkwardly ignored holidays, the silenced conversations, they had all been part of a performance. I had been the outsider in my own life, the ignored sibling whose accomplishments were deliberately minimized and whose presence was actively diminished. Even my parents, whose love I had never doubted, had turned blind eyes to the manipulation, letting Victoria dictate what mattered and what didn't. This betrayal was profound and multifaceted, financial, relational, and deeply personal. It wasn't just about a vacation fund or property, it was about power, recognition, and control within the very people who were supposed to protect and value me. Every slight, every exclusion, every whispered comment had a purpose, to convince me I didn't matter. I sank into the chair in the home office, documents scattered like shards around me. Tears blurred my vision, then hardened into focus. My body trembled with a mix of fury and resolve. I had been invisible for too long. I had been dismissed, silenced, and erased. And then, a single thought crystallized, cold and unwavering: they ignored me. They underestimated me. They think I'm powerless. But they've made the biggest mistake of their lives. The question that hung in the air was unmistakable: what would I do next? For the first few days after discovering the full extent of their betrayal, I felt crushed. My mind replayed every exclusion, every sly comment, every invisible line drawn around me. I questioned everything: my worth, my place in the family, my ability to ever reclaim what had been deliberately withheld. Nights were sleepless, filled with silent tears and the bitter taste of disbelief. For a moment, it seemed easier to accept invisibility, to pretend that their actions didn't hurt, that their manipulations didn't matter. But deep down, I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. The trigger came unexpectedly. While organizing old family photo albums, I found a journal that belonged to my mother. At first, I flipped through it cautiously, expecting ordinary entries about vacations or recipes. But then I stumbled upon candid reflections about family dynamics. My mother had written about my successes, but always with dismissive undertones, emphasizing my lack of maturity or need to learn patience. Victoria's triumphs, by contrast, were praised with effusive detail. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a roadmap of bias, carefully constructed over years. As I read, a spark ignited inside me. I realized that the dismissals, the favoritism, the deliberate erasure, they were all choices, not accidents. They had assumed I would remain passive, that I would silently accept my invisibility. That assumption was their fatal mistake. I understood something crucial: the power to change this story rested entirely in my hands. I didn't need their permission. I didn't need their acknowledgement. I needed strategy, patience, and courage. Over the next few days, I began to transform my despair into determination. I reviewed every document, every correspondence, every decision where I had been left out. I cataloged evidence, noticing patterns, tracing decisions, and identifying weaknesses in their narrative. I reached out to distant relatives and family friends who had quietly observed the favoritism and exclusion. I didn't need allies yet, but I needed perspective and information. Every step I took strengthened my resolve and honed my focus. The Sophie who had once sat quietly at the edge of the table, the one who let her voice be swallowed by laughter and whispers, was gone. In her place was someone calm, precise, and unyielding. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was a strategist, patiently preparing a reckoning that would force acknowledgement, respect, and accountability. That night, I stood in my room, looking at the city lights through the window. I felt a deep, steady pulse of power and clarity. I whispered to myself, almost ceremoniously: they ignored me for years, but now, they will remember my name. And when they do, it will be on my terms. The hero who had been invisible was gone. In her place stood someone ready, not just to reclaim her place, but to make sure the world, and her family, could never doubt her again. The fight was no longer a thought. It had become a quiet, unshakable decision. I treated revenge like an architect treats a ruin: measure every crack, map every hidden corridor, then build the pathway that will let it all collapse on command. My plan had 5 parts: evidence, witnesses, leverage, bait, and timing. Each piece had to fit perfectly. Anything sloppy would let them slip back into their comfortable lies. Step 1: Evidence. I copied ledgers, emails, and the journal entries I'd found into 3 encrypted drives. I scanned invoices that showed the vacation fund withdrawals redirected to accounts controlled by Victoria. I pulled archived photos and tagged messages where my contributions were cropped out or reassigned. Marco, the cousin who still worked in IT for the family firm, discreetly recovered deleted calendar invites that proved meetings about family investments had been held without me. Paperbacks and pixels, everything lined up like a trail of breadcrumbs. Step 2: Witnesses. I reached out quietly to Aunt Rosa, who lived 2 towns over and had always been prickly about favoritism but too afraid to speak up. She agreed to give a sworn statement about years of exclusion. 2 childhood friends, women who'd watched Victoria rewrite my stories at reunions, offered recorded recollections. Even an old neighbor remembered how my name never made it onto guest lists. Their memories were small, human, and powerful when stitched to receipts and timestamps. Step 3. Leverage. I engaged a lawyer who specialized in family trusts. He explained how a single notarized affidavit, backed by financial trails and witness statements, could force a temporary injunction and an accounting of the family funds. That injunction would be the lever that froze their easy narratives and demanded answers in courtrooms where excuses didn't translate into outcomes. Step 4. Bait. People who think they're untouchable are predictable. Victoria loved galas, the glitter, and the applause. I arranged for an anniversary celebration, ostensibly to honor my parents, that would gather every relevant family member, trustees, and a handful of socialites who'd been complicit through silence. I leaked a rumor that I would announce a surprise at the toast. Her curiosity and pride would draw her into the spotlight where exposure would be most painful. Step 5. Timing. Everything had to happen simultaneously: the legal freeze, the witness affidavits, and the social reveal. No chance for a charismatic recovery statement, no room for denial. I rehearsed sequences, cross-checked timestamps, and double-verified every signature. Patience was the weapon, waiting until the moment their masks were brightest to tear them off. All the while, Victoria and my parents carried on in their bubble. They booked the caterer, selected the music, and posed for photos, blissfully convinced their control was permanent. Their confidence made my plan sharper, arrogance always did. On the morning of the anniversary, I dressed not for battle but for presence, simple, composed, unassuming. My lawyer's packet sat sealed in his office. Aunt Rosa's affidavit was notarized. Marco had duplicated the server logs into a secure cloud. I had rehearsal videos, bank printouts, and a timeline that would unspool every secret they'd buried. As I stepped into the car that would take me to the house where I had once been invisible, my phone buzzed. A single calendar alert pulsed on the screen: 6:30 p.m., family toast. Don't be late. I looked at my reflection in the car window, calm eyes, steady hands, and mouthed the words I had sworn to myself weeks ago. Then I tapped send on a message that would begin the sequence. The engine hummed. The city blurred. The rest would be theater, law, and reckoning. I exhaled once, and the world seemed to hold its breath with me. The room shimmered with crystal chandeliers and polished silverware, filled with the laughter and chatter of a family convinced of their perfection. Victoria floated through the crowd like a queen in her own court, the darling daughter, the center of attention, while my parents basked in the illusion that everything was flawless. I stepped inside quietly, my calm presence unnoticed for a heartbeat. Then the first domino fell. My lawyer rose from a side table, clearing his throat. He didn't shout or accuse, he simply produced the evidence in neat, organized packets. The hush was instantaneous. Eyes flicked toward the envelopes, then to me, the daughter they had long ignored. The silence was electric, a taut wire stretching across the room. Step by step, the truth emerged. Marco's recovered server logs showed the deleted calendar invites and manipulated financial statements. Aunt Rosa's affidavit recounted years of subtle exclusion and favoritism. Bank statements proved that Victoria had rerouted funds intended for joint family vacations and investments into her own accounts. Emails, photographs, and recordings lined up like pieces of a puzzle that left no room for doubt. Victoria's laughter faltered first. My parents' eyes widened with disbelief. Every document, every corroborated statement, every time-stamped proof dismantled the narrative they had spent years building. The financial institutions froze the diverted accounts immediately. Trustees demanded emergency meetings. Guests murmured, some in shock, some in awe, as the image of control Victoria and my parents had maintained crumbled in real time. Claire, or rather, Victoria, tried to charm her way out, waving hands, offering explanations, but the evidence was relentless. The lawyer read aloud the injunctions and legal steps, asset freezes, formal inquiries, and mandatory account audits. My parents stammered, caught between disbelief and humiliation, their carefully curated public image unspooling before the very people they had counted on to validate it. The cinematic peak of the moment came as the video I had compiled played on the screen. Side-by-side comparisons showed my contributions in every project, every decision, every family plan that had been taken from me or misattributed to Victoria. The whispers of friends, the testimonies of distant relatives, and my own meticulously documented record converged in one undeniable narrative. I had been erased, underestimated, and ignored, but now the world could see the truth. The collapse was instantaneous. Victoria sank into a chair, face pale, lips quivering. My parents turned away, unable to meet the eyes of the friends and family who now understood the depth of their favoritism and neglect. The empire of mockery they had built atop my struggles lay in ruins, exposed in a single, irreversible sweep. I did not gloat. I did not yell or scream. I stood quietly, shoulders back, chin high. Calm. Present. Victorious. The daughter they had dismissed for years now commanded the room, not with arrogance, but with undeniable authority and proof. For the first time in my life, I felt the full weight of recognition, not as a fleeting acknowledgement, but as a permanent, unassailable reality. They had ignored me. They had doubted me. And now, finally, they would never forget my name. The weeks that followed the family revelation were quieter than the chaos of that night, but far more profound. Victoria was no longer the darling of our circle. Her reputation had crumbled under the weight of evidence, her control over family resources dismantled. My parents, initially in denial, now navigated the uncomfortable reality of their complicity. Their attempts at damage control were muted, their apologies hesitant, and their influence diminished. For me, the consequences were liberating. No longer invisible, I walked into rooms with confidence that had been years in the making. Professional and personal relationships shifted naturally. Friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives now treated me as a force, a person whose accomplishments and presence could not be ignored. Invitations, acknowledgments, and opportunities flowed my way, not because I sought approval, but because the truth could no longer be hidden. Financially, emotionally, and socially, I had reclaimed what had been stolen. But more importantly, I had transformed. The Sophie who had once whispered at the edges of conversations, whose suggestions were dismissed, whose presence was optional, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced betrayal, endured invisibility, and turned every slight into strategy, every insult into fuel, and every exclusion into determination. Poetic justice revealed itself quietly but sharply. The people who had built walls around me, who had mocked my struggles and assumed my passivity, now found themselves pleading for acknowledgement, respect, or reconciliation. Their hubris, their favoritism, and their underestimation had become the instruments of their own downfall. Every laugh that once cut me now echoed back to them, hollow and powerless. I often think back to those family dinners, to the moments when my contributions were ignored or stolen. And I smile, not from malice, but from the satisfaction of justice served. They had underestimated the quiet strength that grows in the shadows, the resilience that forms in isolation, and the clarity that comes from observing rather than reacting. And here's the line I want you to remember: they mocked my struggles, dismissed my presence, and underestimated my power, but I turned every shadow into my stage, and now, they beg at my door. Now, I want to speak directly to you, watching this story unfold. Have you ever been dismissed, overlooked, or betrayed by the people you trusted most? How did it shape your journey, or how are you preparing to reclaim your own power? Share your experiences in the comments. I want to hear your stories, your victories, and even your plans for justice. And if stories of resilience, strategy, and triumph over those who underestimate us inspire you, make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes, the laughter meant to break us is exactly what fuels the strength to rise, and the world never forgets the ones who rise from the shadows.